Today we're looking at 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. As Peter begins to come to a close with his first letter, he shares some comforting thoughts with his readers, who, remember, are facing some degree of grief and suffering, despite their best efforts for the name of Christ. Although we know that suffering is somehow not the way life is meant to be, Peter still makes a startling claim that suffering should not come as a surprise to Christians. In fact, when suffering comes for the right reasons, it is actually an opportunity for joy and blessing. Again, Peter explains that to suffer for being a Christian is to suffer according to God's will. And this indicates that those who choose to suffer for being a Christian, rather than turning aside from following Christ, are already undergoing the end-time judgment that will separate God's people from those who reject him. Peter writes here, "Dear friends, do not be surprised by the fiery ordeal among you that is taking place to test you, as if this were something strange happening to you. Rather, to whatever extent you share in the suffering of Christ, rejoice, so that also when his glory is revealed, you will exceedingly rejoice. If you are vilified because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, the Spirit of God, rests on you. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or even as a meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, let that one not be ashamed, but let them glorify God because of the name. Because it is time for the judgment to begin in the house of God. And since it begins first with us, what will be the end of those who disobey the gospel of Christ? And since the righteous person is saved with difficulty, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? So then, let even those who suffer according to the will of God entrust their lives to the faithful Creator by doing good." In his final statement here, Peter makes 2 points about suffering for being a Christian. He opens with thoughts that such sufferings are to be expected. And he closes with the instruction that those who suffer are to continue to live uprightly as an expression of their abiding trust in God despite circumstances. The startling claim that suffering is not to come as a surprise runs counter to modern sensibilities that consider suffering and hard times to be an abnormal state of life that should be avoided at all possibility. And if suffering cannot be avoided, then it should be dealt with quickly so that normal life can resume as soon as possible. The idea that normal life should always be in harmony and free from suffering and pain, despite universal grief and death, is actually a lingering echo of life as it was in the Garden of Eden with God before the fall. It is also a longing for a time when there will be no more tears, no more pain, no more death, as we find a reference to in Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. Peter, however, is addressing the needs of his people who live in this world right now, where evil, sin, and suffering are present realities. He essentially says, because evil and sin targeted Jesus Christ, those who follow in his footsteps should not be surprised to find themselves the target of those same forces of evil. Consequently, to suffer because one is a Christian is a time to be blessed, because it marks one as belonging to God, as one of God's obedient followers, upon whom his Spirit rests. Remember, Peter is speaking in a time when Christians and their values and their resulting way of life greatly differed from the Greek and Roman society. In that setting, in the first century, one could hardly be an uncompromising Christian and go unnoticed. Our Western modern society, however, has for centuries been largely shaped by Christian values and ethics. From the time of Constantine to recently, at least some part of our Christian faith has been socially acceptable. Because of this, many of us, especially those of us who live here in the United States of America, may not be able to relate to the theme of suffering for Christ. Still, from Peter's time until now, the church has always been persecuted in some parts of the world. And many believers still live with the daily threat of suffering for their faith. To these Christians, Peter's first letter is a precious letter, helping them understand their calling as followers in Christ. If suffering is to be the believer's experience for Christ, Peter frames it as a reason not for bitterness or despair, but rather for joy. This does not mean that believers should enjoy misery, but rather that suffering is the evidence of future end-time deliverance, which will bring about ultimate joy. Society may judge the gospel to be irrelevant or even evil, but it is God's judgment that will ultimately stand. The Christian who, therefore, stands fast and suffers for the gospel now is responding to the eternal reality that will outlast death and even history itself. Peter thus encourages his readers that it is better to remain faithful now than to deny Christ for present relief, only to suffer so much more, so much worse in the coming judgment as one who has denied and rejected the Lord. The idea that God blesses misfortune and suffering may seem strange. All too often, when we suffer and face hard times, we question, God, where are you? Peter's teaching corrects his readers' understanding of that experience. The Spirit of glory and of God rests upon those who are living obediently to Christ. And it is by the power of the Spirit that we find the resolve and the strength to live an uncompromised life in a society that is hostile to Christian convictions and values. God has not abandoned those who suffer. On the contrary, God is powerfully present in the experience of suffering for Christ. Peter goes on to instruct his readers to live in such a way that the only crime against the state or society for which they are guilty is their faith in Christ. Essentially, he says, if you suffer for being a Christian, for living in word and deed consistently with the gospel of Christ, then do not be ashamed if society rejects and reviles you. Faith in Christ is nothing to be ashamed of, even when society says it is. What is more, suffering for Christ is a mark of honor. And in verse 17, the apostle provides the mysterious reason why this is so. He says, do not be ashamed of your faith in Christ. And then he emphasizes in verse 17, because it is time for the judgment of God to begin with the house of God. In other words, with God's own people. Again, this may seem a strange concept to Christians who feel that because of Christ, they are not subject to judgment from God, much less do any suffering or penalty. However, Peter states that the suffering that his readers are experiencing is actually an important part of God's end-time judgment, which all human beings must face. Because of their faith in Christ, though, they need not fear this time of judgment. Certainly, there is unanimous teaching throughout the New Testament that there is no condemnation for those who believe in Jesus Christ, such as Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, verse 1. And that Christians will be delivered from the destiny of those who disobey God by rejecting Christ. But there is also ample teaching that Christians will nevertheless still be judged, and that their standing with Christ is what will bring that suffering moment to a good end. Consequently, the suffering that we bear for the name of Christ, which shames us in the eyes of society, is actually a badge of honor in the eyes of God. For other scriptural references, check out Romans chapter 14, verse 10, and 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10. Still, as Peter writes, the righteous person is saved with difficulty. Peter's point here is not that salvation is difficult for God to achieve. The thought is that the world's response makes it difficult for Christians to remain faithful to Christ to the end. And so Peter wants to know, will you have the resolve and the stamina to persevere to the end? Or will the insults, abuse, social distancing, and even more serious and threatening pressures drive you to deny Christ, renounce the faith, and return to pagan beliefs and living? Peter then goes on in verse 18 to make the negative point that those who reject the gospel of God will suffer much more than anything the Christian will endure now during the hardships and persecution of this life. So, if God is testing his people when he allows them to suffer persecution from pagan hostility, what is the correct response to this situation? Well, in verse 19, the apostle continues, "Let even those who suffer according to the will of God entrust their lives to the faithful Creator by doing good." We seem to assume that God knows what he's doing when we are happy and when we are well. But trouble and difficult times raise hard questions about our relationship with the Creator and about his intent and character. It is easy to trust God when life is good. It is much harder to trust God when we suffer. And especially when that suffering is unjust and is the consequence of living obediently for him. Once again, Peter alludes to following in Jesus' footsteps. For what did Christ do when he was reviled and condemned on the cross? Peter tells us back in chapter 2, verse 23, that Jesus trusted himself to the one who judges justly. Likewise, Peter now encourages his readers to also entrust their lives to the faithful Creator, who is the one who has the authority and the power to judge all humanity justly. How is this trust to be expressed in our lives? By continuing to do good. Again, it is easy to do good when things are good, when we are prospering and healthy. But when we suffer for the consequence of doing good, how reasonable is it to continue to do the very thing that is causing our pain? Well, Peter stresses, continue to live as a Christian. Continue to observe appropriate relationships. Continue to minister to one another in the church. Continue to do good. Don't let suffering stop you from fulfilling your calling in Christ, because suffering is a part of that unique calling. Suffering because one is a Christian, therefore, is neither unexpected nor shameful. It and the honor that results from it are both embodied in Jesus Christ. Suffering in this way is a joy rather than a shock, a blessing rather than an insult.